I wanted to share with you today about how instructors can enjoy teaching. And for me, I enjoy things after I've produced something or created something, and then I can appreciate it at a later time. One example of this would be maybe in the carpentry world. Someone that has built a beautiful home months later can come by and take a look and see what they've produced and find enjoyment in that. What about instructors? What do they find joy in? What are they producing? I found an interesting graphic. I see the word teach in this graphic, but in the reflection I see the word learn. And there's some truth to that. Teaching is more enjoyable when students actually learn. And so is my job to teach, or is it to make sure my students learn? And that got me thinking, maybe that's what I find joy in, is helping students actually learn instead of just teaching. But then I started to ask questions further. Learn, like, what are they learning? How are they learning? At what level? And so that's really what this video is all about, is finding enjoyment in teaching when my students learn in a very specific way. As I began to search for ways to make my course more enjoyable, I began to identify things that I wanted to move away from. I wanted my students to move away from memorizing and regurgitating material. I moved away from delivering just straight up theory, which involved a focus on the textbook. So I started to move away from just using that textbook to drive my courses. I started to lecture a lot less, and I started to use a lot less of PowerPoint. Students were calling it death by PowerPoint. What I started to move towards was a direct application to my courses. I tried to figure out how they applied to the real world, and if I could bring that into the classroom as much as possible, I did that. I wanted my students, when they left my course, to be able to make traction in the workforce, just hit the ground running. And so there was a focus on the hands-on side of things. Really, it became a very practical course, and I found that to be much more enjoyable to deliver, and the students seemed to find it more enjoyable as well. So getting right down to it, to enjoy teaching, it's probably going to involve a process of revitalization for your course. And so I want to take you through a few steps that I've done that seem to produce this kind of course that's more practical and enjoyable. The first step I took towards revitalizing my course is something that I call outcome matching and checking. How that works is I basically start with a conversation. I begin to ask myself, what kind of course am I dealing with? And I begin to think about my course and how it relates to the workforce, and I decide, is this a course that is just a straight application to the workforce, is very, very practical? Is it more supportive of the workforce, and so it's more theory? And at one point, just for myself, I would come up with some sort of a percentage, just in my own mind, and try and figure out what percentage of my course was practical and what percentage is theory. You don't have to do this, but it just gives you a ballpark idea. And then I would carry on the conversation with others. I'd start collaborating with other colleagues and people from industry and professionals, just to try to figure out if my course is on the right track. From there, I start to look at these first words in my outcomes, and these first words are supposed to be verbs, and they tell you what the learners are supposed to do with these outcomes and at what level they're supposed to engage in them. And so keeping in mind my percentage in the corner there, if it's practical or theory, I can sort of start to identify words that fit into both categories. For example, theory words, verbs, would be like list and describe and recall and paraphrase. And so if I could start to use these words in my outcomes to match sort of what amount of course was theory. And then practical words would be design, use, create, produce, construct, experiment. And so if my course was heavy on the practical side, I would start to use these words a lot more. And I think that's the goal as far as enjoyment. I did start to push my outcomes to get them more practical and get that hands-on learning happening as much as possible. The next step I took was to choose good workforce activities. What I did is I thought of what was happening in the real world, in the career that my course had a direct application to. And I began to think about activities that they did in that career, in the workforce. And I thought if I could recreate them in the classroom, that it would just be authentic and get the students right ready when they leave my class to get into the workforce. And so I came up with usually several activities that had a direct application to the workforce and that I could recreate in the classroom, and that I could actually measure easily whether or not the students were meeting those outcomes that the activities focused on. So I would take these activities, I would pull out my course outcomes, and I would cover them up. I would set them right in there and see if my activities were covering those outcomes. And if they were, then I knew it was a good activity, and if they weren't, then I needed to sort of think of a different one. The next area that I focused on was the learning period. During the learning period, I take that activity that I created based directly on the workforce, and I start with it as soon as I can. I just get them doing the hands-on stuff, the practical stuff as soon as I can, and I add theory whenever it's needed. I sort of supplement it. In fact, I make it available at all times so they can get it whenever they need it, but I focus as quickly as possible on that practical hands-on activity, and I found that the course is more enjoyable and learning sort of becomes pretty solid pretty quickly. And I realize sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes there's safety measures that need to be taught, or students would be lost practically without a little bit of theory. But the goal is to get as practical as quickly as possible. Also, during the learning period, I really encourage risk-taking, having the students really get into the learning and not be worried about whether they're doing it right or wrong. Just learn and try things new in a new way, and just sort of have fun with it. During this time, I'm really careful how I mark, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's pretend that I have an outcome that says prepare a balanced chemical solution, and I really like the word prepare, the verb prepare. It's just a very practical verb. Now, along the process of getting to this outcome, I may have a formative assessment or a benchmark activity or a pivotal activity, something. And so let's just say one of the activities is to describe how to balance a chemical equation, and I have the students do that, and then I give the student a mark. And I may have more than one of these, and so as these formative assessments go on, and I continue to give them marks, I really need to think about it. I need to take a second here, because these are actually, they're not really marks, they're actually feedback. This is feedback for the student, and oftentimes an instructor will give them this numerical feedback and then say, come on in and we can discuss, the assignment and how you did on it. A lot of times students don't do that because they've got an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10 and they're fine with their mark kind of thing. But what also one of the dangers is using these marks to sort of represent the actual outcome that was used in the first place, because a lot of times during that initial learning period we're not actually assessing for this outcome. Sometimes we have outcomes that sort of build into, or along the way we use different outcomes to get to this final product over here. And so we really need to be careful that we're not using these marks from these other activities or assessments to indicate what they get on this larger outcome for the course. What I'll do sometimes, instead of giving them marks or numerical feedback that may not accurately describe the outcome I want, sometimes during this formative assessment stage, I will actually not give numerical feedback at all. Instead, I'll give written or verbal feedback, or use a different method of feedback. One of them is for written or verbal feedback is I tell them what's working well, what needs to improve, and how to improve on it, just to keep that learning process going, and so that students don't get wrapped up in just the marks. Another system I use is called a continuum, where if they're working on a project, I will have examples of the project displayed for them on a website or on the wall or something like that, and each example of the project or thing they're working on has a letter grade with it, and so the learner can actually read, like for example, for exercise or example number 5, there will be like a written description as to why this project deserves an A+, and a written description why the next one's an A. And so a student can take their project and measure it against the continuum to find out how they're doing and get feedback that way. So we're encouraging risks, we're careful with our marking, which is actually a form of feedback during this period, and we just want to make sure that we are giving absolutely effective feedback. The next thing that I want to focus on is the assessment period, and in this period of time, it's the same idea as with the learning period. I actually want to use very similar activities or assessments. The same ones would be just great, just tweaked a little bit, but I want to use very similar activities and assessments to actually give them their grades. So I wouldn't, have them doing this big hands-on activity during the learning period, and then during the assessment period, I'm going to give them some paper and pencil test. There's no authenticity there. There's no consistency there. I'm going to try and use the same activities that they're going to use in the real world to assess them on. And so after I do that, I want to make sure they have a marking guide before I go ahead and give them marks. And the marking guide, I'm going to look back to my outcomes and just make sure that I'm actually about to mark for those specific outcomes that I have listed in my course outline. And so they're going to get that ahead of time, and then I'm going to go ahead and mark their assignment, and I'm going to try and do it, very accurately, making sure I'm marking for the right thing. Even then, I'm going to provide feedback for the students, and even though it's at the end of the learning period, it's fine. I think the learning needs to continue, and they need that effective feedback just to continually master this outcome. So the last area that I want to talk to you about is the grading period. And so for the grading period, I want to use that example that we worked with before. Prepare a balanced chemical solution. And so let's say that during the learning period, or maybe during the assessment period, at some point along the way, I have actually given some assessments that pointed directly to this outcome. And so maybe one was in week 1 and I gave them a mark, and in week 3 it pointed right to that outcome, so I wasn't afraid to give them a mark because it was just, it pointed right to the outcome. But maybe then as the student continued to work with this outcome, that there was another assessment that touched on the outcome. So I think I shouldn't be afraid to cancel out those earlier marks and give them a more current mark that is, again, accurately indicating how the student has mastered that outcome for the course. Because I think the final goal is that grades don't reflect the process of learning, but the final mastery of the outcomes. And that's just something that I keep in mind during the grading period, so that I'm sure that when I give them a final grade on the course, that I'm confident that that grade accurately describes how much they've mastered all the outcomes in the course. And so there's the tips that I can give you. Take the ones that work for you and try them, and hopefully, again, the final goal is just to enjoy teaching more. And so I hope that works for you.